Are you seeking a deeper connection to the divine, along with a personal journey of transformation? Welcome to Angelic Magic Classes with White Lotus of Light, where the light of the angels guides you through the realms of spirit, the integration of your shadow, healing of trauma, bringing harmony, abundance, and purpose into your life. In our Angelic Magic classes, you will explore the profound relationship between divine energies and personal growth. By connecting with the celestial angelic realms, you uncover a path to greater happiness, a stronger sense of purpose, and a life filled with abundance of all kinds, from material financial prosperity to an abundance of love and joy in your day-to-day life. Under the guidance of Ian Ferguson and our experienced angelic magic practitioners, you will learn the ancient art of theurgic angelic magic. Explore the metaphysics of magic, the hermetic principles that govern the laws of our universe, sacred rituals, divine invocations, and powerful spells that have been passed down through the ages. Our classes help you align with your higher self, unlocking the key to a more fulfilling life through personal transformation. Discover the divine light within, connect with angelic celestial beings, and navigate and transform the shadows of your internal psyche that hold you back from fulfilling your true divine purpose and mastery of your own life experience. Our course is designed to bring you peace, happiness, and abundance in all areas of your life. Don't miss this opportunity to transform your life with angelic magic and start your journey towards spiritual awakening, personal fulfillment, and a newfound prosperity and joy in your day-to-day life. It is time once again for those who feel the call to pick up the arms and armor of the Most High God and become divine protectors of humanity and join the ranks of the co-creators of this earth realm, that we might bring about a more peaceful, harmonious, and loving planet. Hello, and welcome once again to White Lotus of Light conversational series. I am joined again with Hans Messerschmidt, and he is talking about what I call the Atlantean Diaspora. And we started off in episode 1 talking about Khemet, which is the original name for ancient Egypt. And we talked about a number of very important spiritual concepts and names that leads into this part 2. So if you haven't watched part 1, I'm going to put a link up above. I forget which side it goes on, but I'm going to put a link up above to part 1. And I think this is one of those kind of rare episodes where it's quite important to have the context of part 1 to fully understand part 2. That said, if you want to, feel free to go ahead and start watching from here. So I went with Hans's middle name in part 1, which I will correct in the post, which is Dietrich, because I was reading directly off the screen. In fact, Hans's full name is actually Hans Messerschmidt. So yeah, so I will correct that in later in part 1, and my apologies there, Hans. Hans, if you wanted to jump right into it with, I believe that you were going to talk about the 6 houses here and how that ties into what I'm sort of describing as the Atlantean Diaspora.
So last we were talking about Egypt and the land of Kemet, an alternative history of mysteries by Hans Dietrich. This is my research and study into basically ancient Egyptian and ancient Kemetian history, a lot of which was not told by the Greeks. And
Mm,
so we left off with the 9 souls of the afterlife in the last episode, dealing with the shedding of different layers of your soul when you go into westing.
mhm.
And I'd like to start this series off with talking about the houses or the sacred houses, which were called purs. And so a lot of stuff revolves around 5 concepts with the ancient Kemetians. We discussed the 5 phases of the sun. And so now we'll discuss the 5 sacred houses. Even though there are more than 5 houses, these are the ones that basically hold the most value. So the first, or the 5th house, I should say, is per were. And so the houses or the purs were always depicted in the hieroglyphs as a broken box with either a symbol underneath it or a symbol or a hieroglyph inside of it. And
Mm,
so per were was often depicted either as the broken box with an old man in a cane or just the man in the cane. And this represented the house of the wise or the wiser or the wizard or the wise man. And so what this was a university or a library or a hospital. And these were called the per were.
mm,
The 4th house of importance was called perneter. And so it was represented by the broken box and either the axe head or the flag. And perneter means the house of nature or the house of energy. And
mm,
so this was the ancient depiction of the pyramid. The pyramids were never tombs. There were never any kings found in any of the pyramids. They were all buried in the Valley of the Kings or in mastabas that were near the pyramids. But the pyramids never housed any burials whatsoever. And the Greeks knew this because their word for pyramid was pyramidos, which means fire in the middle. And so they knew it was a house of energy. Excuse me. The 3rd house was per ka. And as we described earlier, the ka is your double or essence of your physical body. And so the per ka would be what we would call today a tomb. This is where the kings were buried. They were buried in the per ka. And it is representational of the duality or the double of your hands. And this is what represented ka. The 2nd house, I'm going backwards from 5 down to 1, would be called per ba. And so this was the house of your spirit. This is a temple. This is a place of worship. And it was often depicted with a bird with your head on it, or the head of a man on a bird. And this represented your spirit or your spirit in flight. And so this comes to the most important of the houses, which was per ah. And it was represented by either the womb or the mace inside or underneath the broken box. And per ah is interesting because this is a representation of the high house, the house of the woman. This is where the word pharaoh comes from. And to be clear, there were no male pharaohs ever in ancient Kem or Egypt. This was a Greek misunderstanding because they saw depicted on the walls a patrilinear expression of passing things down from father to son, king to prince. And they were told that these were under the house or the high house. And so they figured that the high house must be a male house. And so they called all the kings pharaohs. And a lot of modern scholars are smart, and they say in the time of Pharaoh, there was King Ramses or King Tut or King Akhenaten. But in more recent times, archaeologists and Egyptologists have gotten lazy, and they're going back to calling them all pharaohs. This is completely wrong. And the reason being is because ancient Kem in Egypt was a matriarchy. And basically, we know this because the kings could not become crowned or anointed without the overseeing of the high priestess of Hathor, or the high priestess of Isis, or the high priestess of Hatshepsut. And so here is a depiction of the woman or the pharaoh, queen Hathor, the female of the house, which is what we learned in the last episode Hathor means, holding her king Menkaure as if to say, this is mine. And in the patriarchy of today, We see the complete opposite, where the man has his arm around the woman going, yeah, this is mine. And so it's a complete opposite ideology, but instead of it being, oh, the women were in control of everything, it was a unity project. And it made sense that the women would control the fertility of the Nile, the land, and the people, where the men would rule over the Nile, the land, and the people. And so this became a unity between both the king and his consort, or the queen, Pharaoh, and her consort, the king. And so this is where this idea of matriarchy came from, that the Greeks completely washed out of the ancient Khametian history.
Can I ask you a question? Can you go back to the prior slide? I want to point something out, and you may already have noticed this. If you look at this picture of the per-aw, you could say it's a mace, but you could also say it looks like a vagina with a clitoris on top.
Correct.
And I think that that's an accident.
That's why I said, yeah, it's either representation of the reproductive cycle, yeah, or the mace. Correct.
Well,
yes.
Well, perhaps I missed that, Hans, but
I might not have stated it that way, but yeah, but you are correct to say that.
So
very much so.
That's very interesting for a variety of reasons, as is this matriarchy concept during the period of Kemet, because I've talked sometimes on my show how a lot of history, I think, is read incorrectly, and that there could have been more matriarchal influence than is commonly assumed. But I'm not going to bog this down with that concept right now. But please continue.
Well, it's interesting because the Greeks had a word for the matriarchy, and it was matrix, which meant the web, or the mother's web, or the fertile womb, the web of the womb. And so, as I like to quote movies, again, what was the movie The Matrix about? It was about being born out of the web, or out of the matrix, into the real world. So it's a rite of passage in a sense. Anyway, moving on. So we discussed the matriarchy. There are other houses as well that are not as well known. One of them is per Isis, which is interesting because this is the house of Isis, but this is also where we get the word Paris from. And so Paris was considered the house of Isis. It's interesting that we also have this connection with Akhenaten's eldest daughter, Maritaten, or Meritaten, which is a word. Mary is a title, and it means beloved, but it also has a representation of water. And so when the Hanuti priests basically came in and broke up Amarna and the Amarna family of Akhenaten and Nefertiti and their daughters, and Tutankhamun as well, Meritaten took the druids, or her priests of the Akhenaten priesthood, and they fled to Scotland, and she became known as Scotia. And so there is this direct connection with this family, the Amarna ruling family, and the connection to Scotland and the Druids of Scotland. So then we go into the second of the unknown houses, and this is called Per Ankh, which is the house of life. And so since the Ankh represents the key of life, and very interestingly, it also looks like a female reproductive system, where you have the vaginal shaft, the two fallopian tubes, and the womb. This shape was usurped into the cross, which is interesting, but it also is usurped into today's modern symbol for the female, which is a circle on top of a cross. And so this symbology has gone from being the key of life all the way back to the key of life representing the female form.
It's interesting. So, isn't that symbol, though, can't it also be broken into that long part at the bottom can be broken off, and it's the phallus, and then it's the merging of the
correct.
So it's both, right? It's a symbol,
correct,
both, but it can mean just the female form, since that's the primary.
Correct.
Okay.
And you always see the kings depicted in hieroglyphs carrying the Ankh, because they consider themselves the key of life, or the key of the life of the people. In Tanis, or Janet, Yusuf, who's here, found another Per, which is very important because this one gets overlooked. And this is called Peru, which is where we get the word Peru from. And depicted here is basically a glyph that says the land of many houses is across 4 waters from Kemet, or the land under Nut. And so this is what it's representing. And so what would the 4 waters be? Well, you would basically have the Nile, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic Ocean, and the Amazon. If you were to go across the Atlantic Ocean to get to Peru, you would go up the Amazon, and you eventually would end up in Peru,
Amazing.
or the land of many houses. Now, this isn't what Peru was named after, but it is interesting that this concept comes across this way. The other way that you would go would be across the Pacific. And so you would go from the Mediterranean through the Red Sea into the Indian Ocean and across the Pacific Ocean, catching the trade winds and trade currents. And we actually have evidence of this in ancient Khametian and ancient Greco-Egyptian times. And so in 232 BC, an admiral named Mahui and his captain Rata traveled basically from Khem, or Egypt, through the Red Sea, down and circumnavigated around Australia, ended up on the north shore of New Zealand, where he is prominent in the Maori culture, and then crossed the Pacific Ocean, catching the trade currents, which would have put him out around Santiago de Chile. He then would have sailed up the coast of, all of this would have been ancient Inca territory, all the way up to what is Peru today. As Thor Heyerdahl proved with his Kon-Tiki boat, he built Kon-Tiki, he put it in the waters off of Paracas, which is on the coast of Peru, and didn't even put up his sails, and he ended up at Easter Island based on the trade currents. So then it is thought that Maui went to Hawaii from Easter Island, which you can also do with the trade currents, and then back down to the Pitcairn Islands through Tonga, and then through Java and Indonesia, and back to the land of Khem, or ancient Egypt for this matter, because this would have been during the Ptolemaic period of Greco-Egyptian rulership. It's interesting because there's also a thought that catching the trade currents from Hawaii, he could have ended up on the west coast of Mexico and the United States and traveled all the way up into Alaska and back to Hawaii. And it's interesting because the Polynesians talk about this god that came out of the sea and unified all the Polynesian cultures, and his name was Maui. Well, Maui was Maui. He was a real person, and he really existed. And we're told that the Maori of New Zealand were not there past 800 years ago, but in their own indigenous spoken stories, their stories go back about 2,000 years, which would have put them around the time of this Admiral Maui and Captain Rata. And that's fascinating because a lot of the indigenous Maori of New Zealand, when they were doing blood tests on them, because some of them have red hair and green eyes, they discovered that they were coming out of this area of Azerbaijan and Iran and Turkey in the what we call basically the Middle East today, but this would have been Khametian and Phoenician lands back then. And so this is incredibly fascinating as well, because the red-headed, elongated skull people of Paracas, Peru, also have a haplogroup coming out of this exact same region, as do the Basque people of Spain. And they all have this very rich auburn hair and green eyes. And you also have a direct connection to the Drokpa people of who are nomadic from central China or far eastern Kham Tibet, who also have this trait of reddish hair or dark auburn hair and green or blue eyes, which is very, very rare. And this is another topic that I also talk about a lot about.
Real quick, Hans, just to interject, doesn't that also basically come from a haplogroup on the eastern side of or northeastern side of the Black Sea, essentially where the Caucasus Mountains is, and
correct,
the Scythian people specifically?
Correct.
Scythians, is that right?
Correct.
And then
Yes.
they spread out from Scythia actually down to Egypt and Greece and up to northern Europe and down over to western China and down to northern India. Is that accurate in your view?
That sounds about correct, because Azerbaijan is there on the Black Sea and Caspian Sea, and this would have been that area that they would have come out of. Yes. Interesting. And so how do we know that Maui would have been able to travel across the oceans? We are told that a lot of the ancient Egyptians and cultures did not have seafaring vessels, but of course they did. And there's depictions of this in some of the temples in Egypt or Khem. And it's because of the Pacific currents and trade winds. And so if you look at the currents and trade winds, as I have depicted here, you will see how this would have been possible. And so right here in both the Maori tradition and in the Greco-Egyptian or Ptolemaic Egyptian tradition as well, we have this history of Captain Mahui or Admiral Mahui and Captain Rada. And so these are actual people, and they actually did cross over the oceans. And a depiction of this can kind of be found at the Temple of Hatshepsut in Abydos, where we have a seafaring vessel sailing over or rowing over or sailing and rowing over animals that are found in the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, but not in the Mediterranean. And so there's actually a papyrus depiction of this in more modern times, but this is basically what you're looking at in the last picture. And so they had seafaring vessels that would have taken them across the oceans. And some of them were quite large with many sails and places for people to sleep and places where they could bring cargo as well. And so they would have set out with many vessels to explore different areas. And so what evidence do we have in South America that they had come over? Well, it's hard to find, but you go into the Larco Lima Gold Museum, and in the basement of it, where all the gold artifacts are, buried in the back corner, are 3 mannequins wearing some interesting gear. And this is what they look like. And so this is called a Chimu burial headdress from around 1400 AD. But if you look at the one in the middle, this is not a Chimu burial headdress. This is the headdress of Amun coming out of Khemet or Egypt, dated around 1600 BC. And so what is this headdress doing in a Peruvian Inca Chimu burial during this time period, or possibly even older? Well, the thought is that this had come across with these ancient travelers. And as we were talking about Kon-Tiki, when you go into Bolivia, they make these reed boats. And it's very interesting because they make the same reed boats almost out of the same reeds to sail up and down the Nile. And so there's this cross-pollination and cross-cultural pollination there as well. And around 2500 BC, give or take, we have what are called the Gosford glyphs. And so this would have been another sailing voyage that ended up in Australia, where 2 brothers were doing trade with the Australian Aborigines. And when they left after having a good trade, they were caught in a horrific storm system in the Indian Ocean, which capsized the ship. One of the 2 brothers died, and the other one made it back to shore near Sydney. And up in the hills behind Sydney is Gosford Glyphs, is the Gosford Cliff system. And it's a ravine that on both sides of the ravine are these crude scratched in hieroglyphics that a lot of scholars have claimed are fake. We've actually sent 3 independent hieroglyphic experts from Egypt to Gosford to translate them. And the reason why people think that they're fake is because they don't look like anything that you would find on the walls of the temples of the Middle Kingdom and Old Kingdom of Egypt or Kemet, because those are more ceremonial and therefore they're very artistic. This was more of a freehand form. And so what it depicted on the walls was the tale of these 2 brothers coming to Australia, trading with the people. The trading went good. The ship got into a shipwreck. The brother died. And this was basically a memorial from the one brother to his other brother to remember their passage. And so this is interesting because this is around the time of the Middle Kingdom or Old to Middle Kingdom in ancient Egypt, ancient Kemet. And at this same period in time, we find that Tutankhamun had his boomerangs. And so Tutankhamun passed away in 1324 BC, which is around this same time period. And so there had to have been trade going on with the Khametians and ancient Australians, because this is very much an Australian hunting artifact. And the fact that when Carter dug out Tutankhamun's tomb, he found boxes of these things. And so this was definitely something that Tutankhamun was collecting and hunting with during the 18 or 19 years of his life. And so this is the direct evidence, literally, of this trade between Australia and the ancient Khametians or Egyptians. But we also have other artifacts that we can find. Oh, sorry, go on.
I was just saying that's amazing. I mean, just like Australia, Australian contact and trade with the Egyptians in 1324 BC. That's just absolutely incredible. But anyways, please continue.
Well, it also means that there's a possibility that the evidence is there that they had seafaring travel even before that.
Oh
And
yeah.
so we have another example that we find actually in Bolivia. And so on the north shore of Lake Titicaca, about 50 kilometers north of the North Shore, a farmer was digging around in his fields and he found what is called the Fuente Magna bowl. And it's a little under a yard wide. And on the outside of it is a depiction of oceanic creatures. And on the inside of it, ironically, there are two forms of Phoenician cuneiform engraved into it. And what's fascinating about this is the farmer had no idea what he dug up, and so he was using this bowl to feed his pigs, of all
Yeah.
things, until they found on his farm another stele, which is buried in the La Paz Bolivian Museum, unfortunately, never to see the day of light, that also has these two proto, basically Sumerian hieroglyphs, not hieroglyphs, cuneiform writing on them. And so, what does this bowl translate to? Well, it's a decipherment of the inscriptions of the Fuente Magna bowl, indicates that it was used to make libations to the goddess Nia to request fertility and to offer thanks and of the bountiful fauna and flora in the area that made it possible for these Sumerian explorers to support themselves in Bolivia or in this area of the world. And so it's thought that this bowl comes to us also from this time period of around 2500 BC, but this could also be a lot older. We then have another reference. Sorry, did you want to ask something?
Oh, I just said that's so amazing. And like also sometimes people farmer find something in their field and it's like someone has intentionally buried it for whatever nonsense reasons. But the thing is they wouldn't have like proto cuneiform, and also like the guy was using it as a bowl. That's exactly what a farmer would do if they found it. This decipherment of these inscriptions, which is possible, gives a story that makes perfect sense for people in that era and isn't very sexy. Actually, the combination of all these factors makes it, because the skeptics will say, oh, blah, blah, blah about this thing. And I'm sure they have, those
Yes.
planted or whatever. It's not really true because it breaks the paradigm of history that we have, right? But the combination of that plus the stela, the bowl, you put it all together, that sounds like a very reasonable story is from a critical thinking point of view of something that is outside what academia accepts, which goes back to what we were talking about in part one and how important it is to have an open mind. But then ask yourself, because people have put fake depictions of dinosaurs, for example, in carbon figurines that they claimed were proof that dinosaurs existed when the whatever group it was where this was found, and that was a fake.
It's
That was a hoax. And so,
those are the Ica stones. Yes.
yes, yes, and those are pretty clearly, to my eye, a hoax. Whereas this is very credible, but the mainstream academics don't like it. And that's what I'm saying is that it's so important when you're looking at historical stuff that you have that lens of being open-minded, like Hans is talking about a bunch of paradigm breaking stuff here, but you look for, is it backed by physical evidence? Look at these trade currents. Look at this record of Moai we have. Look at this discovery story of how this Fuente Magna bowl of Bolivia was discovered. It makes sense when you have a critical lens. You look at it critically and go, is someone trying to scam? And then you start having enough factors in there and you go, no, this looks pretty credible, actually. I'm sorry, I just wanted to lay that out there because some people didn't appreciate what I was trying to say in the episode that'll be right before this one, because I was talking about the importance of critical thinking, and so was Professor Michael Flem about the way to study history with the critical lens, understanding that you're looking at a vague approximation through the lens of the eye of the victor, right? But you can't just throw the baby out with the bathwater and ignore the fact that the Roman Empire definitely existed, and we have incredible amounts of stuff to back that up. Anyways, please continue. I just wanted to interject that because you're making amazing claims, but you're backing it up with stuff that just makes sense to a logical, critical thinker.
Yes, and that's interesting that you say that. dealing with the ecostones and whatnot. There's a piece of pottery in the museum in Lima as well, and it's a urn for water, or ceremonial urn, and it clearly depicts a mammoth on the side of it.
Mm.
And this is interesting because there were no mammoths in recent time in South America. But what's even more interesting is at Chichen Itza, when we went to Chichen Itza on our tour with Grandmaster Timothy Hogan, he took us to a temple that a lot of the tour guides will not take tourists to, because there are depictions on this temple that do not make sense or fit within the Mayan pantheon of imagery. One of them is that on all the corners of the temple are the depictions of elephant heads. Well, there are no elephants in Central America. And on the temple in the backside, there is a man or a god or a depiction of a human or a person sitting in lotus position, in the meditator's position from South Asia. And so what is this doing in the Mayan temple structure? And so I've thought that was incredibly fascinating, that here we have, even more evidence that there has been a knowledge exchange across the globe of different things. And speaking of a knowledge exchange in the Mayan culture, in Egypt, or ancient Khem, we have this depiction of this character we call Maya. And so Maya in the ancient Suf language, like As or Askat, meant water. To the Vedics, it meant love, but it also meant illusion. And so when you're looking at your reflection, your Maya or your Mara in water, you're seeing an illusion of yourself that then you either fall in love with or you don't. And so this is an interesting concept around Maya as being illusion to the Vedics, but it also meant water to the ancient Khametians. And so there is a tomb in Saqqara called the Tomb of Maya. And on the left is a depiction of the character called Maya, and he looks like he's a Khametian. He's wearing the fake hair. A lot of the ancient Khametians wore these fake wigs. It's really interesting going into the museum and seeing all these dreadlocked wigs that people would wear. But when you go to Elephantine Island and the Temple of Isis at Philae Island, which was not originally at Philae Island, but when they created the Aswan Dam, they flooded that whole area of the Nile, and they had to move the temple. And so they rebuilt the temple. Not all of it fits together as perfectly as it should, but there is this depiction on the right of this character, Maya, wearing the feathered serpent headdress and giving gifts to his Khametian friends from lands afar, as well as what you see in the center, which is at the temple at Elephantine Island. And basically, this is what the feathered serpent or the Kukulkan headdress looks like. And you don't see a depiction of anybody else in the hieroglyphs wearing anything remotely like this. And so this right here is a strange connection with the Maya or Mayan culture, or people from across the water coming to and being ambassadors in the ancient land of Kemet. But we even have more evidence of this, because when you go into the tomb of Maya in Saqqara, like I said, nothing looks out of place, but you pay the guard a little bucksheesh and he takes you into the next room, and you look around the next room and you say, I don't really see anything in there either. And then he turns on his torchlight and he shines it up at the ceiling, and you see this. This is not Khametian hieroglyphs. These are not Egyptian hieroglyphs. These are not Greek hieroglyphs. These are Mayan glyphs from an ancient Mayan calendar system, showing dates and approximations of when this character Maya had come to Saqqara, or had come to ancient Khem. And it's interesting because we've had Mayan elders actually look at this, and they admit to it that this is ancient Mayan glyphs, but they are no longer used. And this is a similar concept to what we hear about in ancient Peru, because in ancient Peru, we have the Inca and their runners would run with these knotted rope systems they called quipu, because we are told that they didn't have a physical written language that they could communicate with each other. And so they'd make these knots. Nobody's actually deciphered what the quipu mean. And they would run on some of the hairiest trails you've ever been on in your life, where you're running up the side of a cliff on logs that have been hammered into holes in the side of the cliff while you're looking down 2,000 feet, and you're running to the next village with the quipu. But when Brian Forrester and I were in Cusco in 2014, we went into the museum and there's a tapestry in the museum. It's interesting because this is what the tapestry looks like. Much like the glyphs on the left, which are this calendar system, the tapestry on the right has many similarities of glyphs, but they're not in any precise order, as if they are spelling out different concepts that are using and repeating some of these similar shapes and forms, versus something that's more uniform, like a checkered floor or whatnot. And so to me, this is fascinating that in this tapestry, we have a physical written Inca language through Inca glyphs that is overlooked by a lot of academia because they just want to stick to the story that the Inca, weren't super sophisticated and they only had this knot system and that's how they communicated.
Yeah.
And so we find more of this in Egypt with what we call the feathered serpent motif of Kukulkan or Quetzalcoatl. And so Kukul means the serpent and Khan was the condor. And so Kukulkan was this feathered serpent character. But at the Temple of Isis, we find a similar deity holding the duality rods of harmony sitting underneath the feathered or winged serpent. And this is very, very similar to what we find at Monument 19 at La Venta, coming out of the Olmec culture, where you have Kukulkan here, or Quetzalcoatl, holding the man bag of seeds, which we think is what was held in it, seeds or artifacts of trade. And so here we have these two opposing monuments halfway across the world from each other, almost depicting the same thing.
Amazing.
And so this also gets into other depictions that we find in Egypt that kind of connect what we were talking to in the last episode about the exodus or the dispersal of Atlantis. And so in my studies and my belief around Atlantis was not a place, it was a time. Because we're told through the Critias and Timaeus that there were 5 different capitals. And so these 5 capitals were in 5 different lands, with Poseidon being the most important, which is where we get the story of Atlantis sinking into the ocean. And this would have been Poseidon. And so it's interesting that you go into 3 temples actually in Egypt, or Kemet for this matter, and one of them being the Dendera temple, which on its ceiling shows the entire cosmology of all the netters and all the areas of time, and it's all underneath Nut, which is shown as the Sacred Mother or the Milky Way. But one of the depictions on the ceiling is this, and this is depicting the exodus of Atlantis. And we find a similar depiction of the exodus of Atlantis at the Edfu temple, and almost identical to the one at the Edfu temple is this one, which is at Karnak, and this is on the back wall of one of the temples at Karnak. And Karnak is such an amazingly large site that you could spend 2 weeks there and see about a fifth of it. I mean, there's so much to see there. And Chichen Itza is one of these sites also. I mean, you'd have to go there 3, 4, 5 times just to see the site because there's so much going on at that site. But this is depicting the exodus of Atlantis. And I believe the only other place that we find this other than Edfu, Karnak, and the ceiling of the Dendera temple is in the texts of the Unas pyramid, which are known as the pyramid texts. More stuff that you find on the ceiling of Dendera is the history of the cosmos, basically showing all of the different netters in their barks or their sacred cosmic boats. And they did a great job of cleaning this up because this entire ceiling was just littered with soot from all the different torches that had gone through there over the years of history of people coming to this site. But surprisingly, in one corner, they left one cube dark, as if to say, this is what it used to look like, and this is what, the restoration looks like. And it's interesting because on the left of this black spot, we have Horus, which represents healing. And on the right, we have Jehuti. Well, Jehuti has 2 names. We know Jehuti as Jehuti and Tehut. And Tehut was where we get the name Thoth from. And so Thoth was an Atlantean. And Thoth was the architect with Imhotep, who supposedly designed and built the Great Pyramid and the other pyramids of the ancient times, which I believe, as well as many other scholars do as well, that the pyramids are much older than we're being told they are. There is clear water damage on all three of the Great Pyramids at Giza, as well as water damage in the Sphinx enclosure.
Yeah.
And so the water damage, according to more than one geologist, I mean, Robert Schoch is the one that put it out there with John Anthony West, but he's had over 200 other geologists confirm this, that it's water damage. Well, the last time there was major amounts of water in this area of Egypt, basically Giza, was 10,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And so it would have had to rain for, 1,000 years to get the kind of water damage that you're seeing there in the limestone. And this is what the Sphinx was cut out of this enclosure. And the blocks of this enclosure are what make up the Valley Temple and the Sphinx Temple, which sit in front. And so it's interesting, though, that the character in the black cube is known as Heket. And Heket was a female netter, and she represents a frog. And so the frog represented rebirth because, as we know, frogs are somewhat asexual and they can impregnate themselves and then rebirth themselves. And this is fascinating because also found at Dendera in the catacombs are what are known as the famous Dendera light bulbs. And many scholars will think, this is a representation of the aspect of the snake, the lotus flower, and the energy that the snake, withholds. But holding up the energy is the Jed pillar, and the Jed pillar is a representation of Osiris's backbone, but also represents duality. And standing at the end, we have Heket holding the divining rods, these two knives. And supposedly the text says that, Heket fought off the enemies with these two blades, but Heket is a representation of rebirth. So this would be of a duality of sorts, this rebirth of a duality. And it's really hard to get photos of the light bulb. There's more than one. We're usually only shown this one because the passageway that this is in is basically depicted on the right there with this gentleman walking through it, is not very wide. And so it's very difficult to get actually a good picture of this. And so sitting directly across from the last picture is this, which shows two more light bulbs, or these lotus bulbs, or whatever we're going to call them. And it's interesting because the snakes represent the Kundalini energy. Mm-hmm. And as you see, there's 7 wraps in the snakes. Both of these have Jed pillars. Both of them have the lotus flower plugged into the Jed pillar, or the stand of which the Jed is sitting on. And so it's fascinating that we have this depiction. But there's even one more depiction of the Dendera light bulb. And that's not even in the catacombs. It's actually up in one of the main chambers, and it's high up on the wall, and it's this. And you'll notice that a lot of sites of ancient Egypt, ancient Kemet, you'll see that the characters have had their faces and part of their bodies removed. And so a lot of these sites have been attacked. And not just attacked to remove characters, but also attacked where a king or a ruler would come in and graffiti his name on top of everything, deep chisel style, so that nobody can remove it, as if to say or claim, this is mine, or this is a depiction of me. And so what's interesting about the Dendera light bulb in general is that we know the ancients had use of magnets and magnetic stone. And we know that they also had use of this stone here, which is black tourmaline. And black tourmaline actually conducts small amounts of electricity, as do the pyramids themselves. If you put quartz or quartzite or even granite under pressure, you will create what is considered a piezoelectric pop or charge. And so this is a thought as to why the perneter, or the pyramidos, the fire in the middle, the pyramid, was not a tomb, but actually functioned more as a natural machine harnessing nature's energy, similar to what Tesla was doing.
Correct.
And so we have, plasma containers, basically similar to what the Dendera light bulb looks like that we use today. And plasma can be generated basically, as we see in the bottom right, off of this stone, this black tourmaline. Thank you. And to even, signify this even more, when they sent up the Gantenbrink's robot into the Queen's shaft, basically, and came across this plug, they realized that sticking out of the plug are 2 copper cords that have broken off eroded and broken off. And when they drilled through and looked from the other side, these two plugs have loops going through them. And so this would have been for a positive and a negative charge of something that was happening inside of the Great Pyramid to be utilized as some sort of an electrical device. And so it's right there for all to see, but academia just doesn't want to see it.
And so you might get into this, and if you do, great. But Timothy Hogan has said that the supposed king's sarcophagus is actually the exact dimensions that we were passed down to us of the Ark of the Covenant.
Yes.
It's part of an arc technology, and that arc technology and the monoatomic gold, that it seems to act as some kind of capacitor or not sure, battery, I guess, for lack of a better word, can hold a tremendous electrical charge. And if you have that at the center of a pyramid, then you collect the energy in the arc. Is that approximately correct?
Yes, I would say exactly correct, because when you go into the king's chamber, here we are in the king's chamber. Because you're in a Muslim country, they tell you can't chant, you can't meditate, you can't have religious practice, you can't have weddings, you can't have any sort of pagan ritual in there, because they want to, keep the Islamic faith alive. But when you go on these tours and you're on a private tour, you're given 2.5 to 3 hours alone in the pyramid. Whereas if you go by yourself, you pay about $200. It could be more now. And they only take you to the king's chamber, and that's it. And so it's funny, because the first thing people do when they get into the king's chamber is they start toning and chanting, or split toning. I'm split toning. And the room tones to F sharp, which is interesting. Because the king's chamber tones to F sharp, the grand gallery tones to F sharp at a different octave, and the queen's chamber also tones to F sharp. And so everybody's in here toning. We actually had a wedding in the pyramid, which was kind of awesome. My friends from New Zealand decided, we broke them all, and we had a blood sacrifice. So this unfortunate gentleman on the left hand side, you can see in front of him is this big pile right here. This is his blood.
Whoa!
This guy's like 6'4", and so when you're going into the king's chamber, you go through a passageway that's a little bit over 1 meter by 1 meter. And so you're scraping your head along the ceiling until you get into the king's chamber to kind of guide yourself. But most people don't know that about halfway down this tunnel is an alcove. And it goes up, and there's all these relieving bricks, and then that goes up into the relieving chambers. And so if you're not paying attention, you're scraping your head along, and all of a sudden you bob your head up into the alcove, you're going to smack your forehead into the next wall, which is razor sharp, before you have to duck down again to go into the king's chamber. And so this guy sadly wasn't paying attention, and he smacked his head real hard. Yeah, you cut his whole forehead open. Wow. And he's like, "Damn it! I paid good money to be here, so I'm just gonna stick around and tough it out." And so we always joke that we had this blood sacrifice in the pyramid. But when you get into the actual box, which Grandmaster Timothy Hogan was talking about, held the Ark of the Contract or the Ark of the Covenant. There were many arks. There weren't just one. It is exactly 1 cubit by 2 cubits, or 1 cubit by 3 cubits, which was the dimensions of the Ark. And when you get in the box and you tone in the box tones at A. And so all around you, you have F sharp, and then you have a resonant third above that as A in the box, and you're creating this energy vortex around you, which is why people say when they get in the box, they feel like they're having an out-of-body experience, because quite literally, this is what it feels like when you're toning at A and the rest of the room is toning at F sharp. And you feel like you're having this pressure system around you. And all of a sudden you're like, wow, I'm not in the pyramids. I'm in the middle of the universe, and I'm floating in this pink granite box inside of a pink granite room. And it's an incredibly fascinating experience. And then I like to go all the way down once they open it up, the descending passage to the subterranean shaft or subterranean area, where there's a well shaft that goes down. It's cemented off at the bottom. Gee, I wonder who could have done that. The Ministry of Antiquities, because they don't want people going down there and exploring the tunnel systems that go off of this. And I usually get down there 10 or 15 minutes before anybody else. I'll climb to the end of the dead end shaft, which is only about a meter by a meter, and you're ripping your knees to shreds across the rubble of the bedrock limestone. And you get to the end of that, and as you can see here, it's also cemented off, and there's a drill hole through it. So this shaft keeps going. But I will sit down there, I'll turn my torch off. I mean, you don't get reception with any of your electronics anyway. And I will tone for about a minute or two, and then I will go completely silent. And you're in complete blackness, you're in complete silence. It's like being in a sensory deprivation chamber without the water and the 2,000 pounds per square inch of salt. And the noise in that meditational stance is so deafening, it's unbelievable. But you have to realize you're not hearing any noise coming from outside. It's all your internal noise. It's all your internal vibration. And so you go to the King's Chamber, you have an out-of-body experience, then you go down to the subterranean area and climb to the dead-end shaft, and you have basically a grounding, bringing yourself back into yourself. And so it's interesting that we see a lot of these different elements in some of the other pyramids, like the Red Pyramid and the Bent Pyramid, which we're told was basically a mistake, so they changed the angle of it. And King Sneferu was the one that, built the Red Pyramid and the Bent Pyramid. Well, Sneferu, going back to the Cometian Suf language, was not a name, it was a title. And so Nefer, or Snef, basically, or Sin, sorry, means dual, and Neferu, or Nefer, means harmony. And so Sneferu represents dual harmony. And so when you go into the Red Pyramid, basically, and you descend down the shaft all the way into the Red Pyramid, you have two chambers that harmonize at different frequencies, Chamber 1 and Chamber 2. And then you have to climb all the way up Chamber 2 to get into Chamber 3, which is quite a haul to get up there. You go up this rickety staircase and then down the hallway. And Chamber 3 doesn't resonate anymore because, once again, they were looking for stuff in here. And so they dynamited out the floor and they put another cement plug in here because, as I showed in 2 pictures earlier, Chamber 3 goes in a different direction. It heads east versus Chamber 1 and Chamber 2, which head north. And so there's a thought that this dual harmony repeats on the other side of Chamber 3, which is why they went in there to dig up the floor to see if there were more chambers and to dig through the wall to see if this actually went to another chamber on the other side, which is sad. It really is. Anyway, I could keep going on. I've got so many different slides here, but the majority of stuff, we were talking about was some of these ancient cultures and ancient civilizations. And actually, I could talk a little bit more about the whole Atlantis situation, because when you get to the Giza Plateau, we're not really told in history, but underneath the Giza Plateau, there are 10 levels about the size of cargo containers inside of tunnel systems stacked on top of each other that go 50 to 80 kilometers out into the western desert. And so after the Great Cataclysm of the Ancient Khemet breaking up over North America and spreading its debris all the way into Iran, some of the debris would have splashed down in the Mediterranean. And as the sea levels literally rose overnight, 500 feet, it would have pushed a lot of the Mediterranean water up and over into the jungles of North Africa, which are now all the Sahara Desert. This is all desert, become desert since then. And if you look from satellite photos, you can see where this massive body of water came down the west side of Giza, where today the Nile is on the east side of Giza. And so this was known as the Ur-Nile. It was a German gentleman named it, but they called it the Ur-Nile. And it was where massive amounts of water were. So they were bringing water from the Western Nile all the way to the ancient sites through these underground tunnel systems, because all of these sites are not only built on ley lines, they're all built over water aquifers or water reservoirs. And so when you're walking around the Giza Plateau, you'll come upon all these pits that go down and down and down, but they're now, filled up with sand and trash from tourists and plastic bottles, and it's really quite sad. But this depiction on the right shows in front of one of the three smaller pyramids in front of the Great Pyramid, basically, is a tunnel that goes down. And supposedly there was a sarcophagus, or what we call one of these boxes, or harmonic boxes, at the bottom of this. And it's interesting because this pit on the left is literally where the pit on the right is depicted in the drawing. And it goes down, a couple hundred feet before you hit sand. And then there are tunnel systems that go off of this. And interestingly, between the Great Pyramid and the Middle Pyramid, right underneath the causeway that goes down toward the Great Sphinx, was discovered what they called the Osiris Shaft. And so this goes down several hundred feet as well into the ground. And as you can see, you go down this very rickety staircase on the left. And I was one of the first people down, taking my life into my hands, going into the darkness, because I have vertigo. And if I can't get over it, instantly, it's just going to cause this pressure system in me. It's like vertigo and claustrophobia. They both aren't faint of heart. Going to these sites, you definitely will have both. And so you get down to the bottom, the guide that's down there will flip the lights on so everybody else can see. But you go down three levels, but this is the equivalent of about 6 to 10 stories of a building that we would consider a building today. And you get down to the second level, and there are 6 alcoves, all of which have very crude sarcophagus in them, except one, which is this black box. It's very finely polished, very highly cut, with straight edge angles, 90-degree angles, 90-degree corners. And it has this black goo, this interesting oil or soot on it that I think is a creosote from them burning stuff down there for many, many, many years. Then you descend down to the bottom section, which is where they call this the Temple of Osiris, or Osiris tomb. And in the 90s, there's a ABC documentary with Zahi Hawass, and he has basically pumped all the water out of this reservoir so that they could open up this green quartzite granite box that comes from Lebanon to see what's in it. Hey, there's a body in it. Maybe it's Osiris. Well, they found nothing in it, just like they found nothing in any of the boxes of the Seraphim either. And what's fascinating about this box that sits underneath the water, because this is where the oceanic water table, or the Mediterranean water table, now is. So this is like 100, 150 feet, maybe more underground is where the water table is now. This green quartzite box doesn't fit down any of these shafts. So how did it get down there? And this is very similar to the box that's in the king's chamber. And so the box would have had to have been built into the king's chamber. But here we're down underneath the limestone bedrock. How did they get this box down here? Well, there are 2 tunnels that go off left and right from where this box sits. And one of them goes back literally toward the well shaft underneath the Great Pyramid. And we don't know where the other one goes to. But again, the well shaft in the Great Pyramid is too small for this box to fit down either. And so it just really begs the question, how on earth did this box get down there? Because it doesn't fit in any of the shafts going down there. So
wow.
Again, this could be a remnant from a much older civilization.
Wow. That is incredible. Well, Hans, just in the interest of time, I think that this is a good spot maybe to end this part of the presentation. I'll have to have you back because it seems like you have a lot more material, and this is mind-boggling. So I will have to have you back, Hans. Did you want to have any final thoughts for any of the viewers of places where they could jump off with this information for their own explorations?
So I have a lot of this on my actual website, which is megalithic.mysteries.com. It has some of my tours to Egypt as well as Peru there. It has other lectures that I've done and interviews I've done there as well as my 2 books. One is on the Dropa, Legends and Lore, connecting the ancient secrets of Bhutan, China, Nepal, Tibet, and Sirius.
Fantastic.
And the other is on the magic of symbols. And so, as I do a lot with occult symbology, a lot of the information that I've shared in these last 2 episodes dovetails and overlaps into both of these stories. And another great book that we had discussed in the last episode that I pulled off my shelf kind of difficult to find. It's a little expensive or expansive. It's called The Last Atlantis Book You'll Ever Have to Read. And it connects Atlantis with Mexico and India. And so there's a lot of overlay between the Mayan culture, the Hindu and Vedic cultures, as well as the Cometian and Phoenician cultures, through languages, through gods and goddesses, or netters, which were the aspects of nature, and even through, as we were discussing, chakras and veils and the different layers of the energy of the soul and the body. And so, yeah, you can find my stuff at megalithic.mysteries.com or megamist.com, which is the shorthand of that, or on my YouTube channel, Giza Direct. Just Google YouTube Giza Direct. And
I'll have all the links below. I'll have all the links below in the description.
I have lectures from Brian Forrester when we were in Egypt in 2018 there, Patricia Iwan, her lecture, Yusuf Iwan's lecture is there as well. I believe Hugh Newman's lecture and Andrew Collins's lectures are also there. And they're all talking a lot about similar aspects of what I've just discussed in these last 2 episodes. So go there and check them out. I'll be in the links in the bottom. Yeah. But I appreciate your time, Ian. I thank you so much for having me on both of these shows. And I look forward to doing more shows with you. So.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic. Love to have you on, especially I'll have to have you on with one of the episodes with Michael LaFlamme in the future.
That would be amazing. That would be really amazing.
Okay, well, and if you got this far, viewer, please hit like, subscribe, and click the bell to make sure that you are getting all the updates when it comes through White Lotus of Light. And I will catch you guys next time. All right, bye-bye.